It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in Meadow Hills. Meadow Hills was a small, quiet neighborhood where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. Kids played in their yards, dogs barked at squirrels, and old folks sat on porches sipping lemonade. Everything was calm and normal until Jake Miller moved in. Jake was a tall guy with messy, scruffy hair that stuck out in all directions. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't wave at everyone or throw big parties. Nope, Jake was the kind of person who liked to be alone. He spent most of his time in his garage, messing around with tools and fixing things. Sometimes you'd hear a hammer banging or a saw buzzing, but that was it. Most people in Meadow Hills didn't even notice him. They walked by his house, saw his old truck in the driveway, and kept going. To them, Jake was just another guy. But one person noticed Jake right away. Her name was Karen Whitmore, and she wasn't just any neighbor. Karen was the president of the HOA. That stands for Homeowners Association, a group that makes rules for the neighborhood. Karen loved rules more than anything. She carried a big clipboard everywhere she went, scribbling notes about people's houses. Her eyes were sharp, and her frown was even sharper. When she looked at you, it felt like she could scare a bear away with just one glare. Karen acted like Meadow Hills was her kingdom. She marched up and down the streets like a queen, telling everyone what to do. "Your grass is too tall," she'd yell at one house. "Your trash cans are out too early," she'd snap at another. People listened because they didn't want trouble. Karen had a way of making you feel small if you didn't follow her rules. She'd stand there with her clipboard, tapping her pen, waiting for you to say sorry or fix whatever she didn't like. And then there was Jake. Poor Jake didn't know it yet, but he was about to become Karen's #1 problem. See, Jake had this mailbox. It wasn't a shiny new mailbox like the ones on every other house. Nope, his was old and rusty, with scratches and dents all over it. But Jake didn't mind. He liked it that way. He even put a little lock on it, not a big, fancy lock, just a small one you'd use on a diary or a toy box. He fixed it up himself one afternoon, hammering and twisting until it worked just right. To Jake, it was no big deal. It was just a mailbox. But to Karen? Oh boy, that mailbox was like a giant red flag waving in her face. The first time she saw it, her eyes got wide, and her mouth turned into a thin, angry line. She stopped right in the middle of the street, staring at it like it was the most dangerous thing she'd ever seen. "A locked mailbox," she muttered to herself. "In my neighborhood." She gripped her clipboard tighter and started writing something down. To Karen, that rusty old mailbox wasn't just a mailbox. It was a mystery. It was a problem. It was a crime waiting to happen. Now, let's rewind a bit. Jake had only been in Meadow Hills for a couple of weeks. He moved into a small house at the end of Pine Street, the kind with chipped paint and a squeaky front door. It wasn't the prettiest house, but Jake didn't care. He liked fixing things, and this house gave him plenty to work on. The neighbors didn't know much about him. Some said he was a mechanic because of all the tools in his garage. Others thought he was just a quiet guy who didn't like talking. Either way, they left him alone. Meadow Hills was a friendly place, but people didn't poke their noses into your business unless your name was Karen. Karen had been the HOA president for years. She wasn't elected because everyone loved her. No, she was the only one who wanted the job. Most folks were too busy or too scared to argue with her, so they let her take charge. And take charge she did. She made rules about everything. Your dog couldn't bark too loud. Your car couldn't park crooked. Your flowers had to be the right color. If you broke a rule, Karen would show up at your door with that clipboard and a big speech about keeping the neighborhood nice. People rolled their eyes behind her back, but they didn't dare say no to her face. So when Jake showed up with his rusty mailbox and his quiet ways, Karen didn't know what to think. He didn't fit her perfect picture of Meadow Hills. He didn't wave at her or smile when she walked by. He didn't even come to the HOA meeting to introduce himself. To Karen, that was suspicious. And that locked mailbox? That was the final straw. She decided right then and there that Jake was trouble. She didn't know who he was or why he was here, but she was going to find out. The first time Karen met Jake, it didn't go well. It was a few days after he moved in. She marched up to his front porch, her shoes clicking on the sidewalk, her clipboard ready for battle. Jake was in his garage, fixing an old lamp he'd found in the house. He had a screwdriver in one hand and a rag in the other, wiping grease off his fingers. Karen didn't knock. She just stood there and cleared her throat real loud, like a teacher calling the class to attention. Jake looked up, squinting in the sunlight. Hi, he said, setting the lamp down. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. He just looked at her, waiting. Karen didn't waste time. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Meadow Hills HOA, she said, puffing out her chest like it was a big deal. And you are? Jake Miller, he said simply. I just moved in. Karen nodded, but her eyes were already darting around, looking for something to complain about. That's when she saw the mailbox. It was sitting there by the curb, rusty and locked, like it was daring her to say something. She pointed at it with her pen. What's that? She asked, her voice sharp. Jake glanced over. My mailbox, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Why does it have a lock? Karen snapped. Her pen was hovering over her clipboard now, ready to write him up. Jake shrugged. Keeps it safe, he said. He didn't explain more than that. He just picked up his screwdriver and went back to his lamp, like the conversation was over. But for Karen, it was just beginning. She stood there, staring at him, her face getting redder by the second. Safe from what? She demanded. This is a good neighborhood. We don't need locked mailboxes here. Jake didn't look up. It's just a lock, lady, he said, twisting a screw into place. No big deal. Oh, but to Karen, it was a big deal. She didn't like being called lady. She didn't like being ignored. And she really didn't like that Jake wasn't scared of her. Most people in Meadow Hills would have apologized or promised to fix whatever she didn't like. But Jake? He didn't care. He just kept working on his lamp, like she wasn't even there. Karen huffed and turned on her heel, stomping back to the sidewalk. She scribbled something on her clipboard, probably a note about Jake and his suspicious mailbox. As she walked away, she muttered to herself, this isn't over. And she was right. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. From that day on, Karen had her eye on Jake. Every time she walked by his house, she'd slow down and stare. She'd look at the mailbox, then at the garage, then back at the mailbox again. She started asking the neighbors about him. Who is this Jake guy? She'd say. What's he doing here? Why's his mailbox locked? Most people just shrugged. They didn't know, and they didn't care. But Karen cared. She cared a lot. To her, that mailbox wasn't just a rusty old box. It was a secret waiting to be cracked open. What was Jake hiding? Was it something big? Something bad? Karen didn't know, but she was going to find out. She made it her mission to watch Jake like a hawk. Every move he made, every time he stepped outside, she'd be there, clipboard in hand, ready to catch him doing something wrong. But here's the thing, Jake wasn't worried. He didn't run around acting nervous or sneaky. He just kept doing his thing, fixing stuff in his garage, mowing his lawn, living his quiet life. If Karen's glares bothered him, he didn't show it. He'd wave at her sometimes, just to mess with her, and then go back inside. It drove her crazy. And that's where our story really starts. A sunny Saturday morning, a rusty mailbox with a little lock, and a nosy HOA president who couldn't let it go. What was going to happen next? Would Karen figure out Jake's secret? Or was she about to step into something she couldn't handle? Before we go on, what do you think? Was Karen right to freak out over a mailbox, or was she just looking for trouble? Tell me below. Okay, let's dive into this part of the story. It all kicked off with something super tiny, a mailbox lock. Yep, just a little lock on Jake's mailbox. Jake was the new guy in the neighborhood, and he liked keeping things private. So, he put a lock on his mailbox to keep his letters safe. Easy peasy, right? It made sense to him. No big deal. But oh boy, not to Linda. Linda was the bossy lady who ran the neighborhood group called the HOA. That's short for Homeowners Association, which is like a club that makes rules for everyone's houses. Linda loved rules more than anything. She loved them so much she carried a clipboard everywhere, writing down stuff about people's yards and cars. And when she saw Jake's mailbox lock, she flipped out. Picture this, Linda marched over to Jake's house like she owned the whole street. Her face was redder than a big, juicy tomato you'd see at the grocery store. She pointed at the mailbox and yelled, "Hey! We don't do locks around here. That's against the rules." Her voice was loud, like a barking dog. She stood there with her hands on her hips, waiting for Jake to say sorry or something. But Jake? He didn't even blink. He just looked at her with a little smile and said, "It's my mailbox, ma'am." That's it. Super calm, super simple. No yelling, no fighting. Just those few words. But to Linda, that was like throwing a giant water balloon in her face. She didn't like it one bit. Nobody told her what to do. Nope, not in her neighborhood. Linda's eyes got all squinty, and she huffed like a dragon puffing out smoke. Then she puffed like she was blowing up a balloon. She grabbed her clipboard, that thing she always carried, and started scribbling fast. Her pen scratched the paper so hard you could hear it from across the yard. "Troublemaker," she muttered under her breath. "He's a troublemaker." She said it like Jake was some sneaky bad guy in a movie, twirling a mustache and laughing. Jake didn't argue. He didn't shout back. He just watched her stomp away, her shoe smacking the sidewalk. But here's the thing, Linda didn't know it yet, but she just started a big fight. Not with fists or anything silly like that, just with her nosy ways and Jake's quiet stubbornness. And trust me, this fight was going to get wild. From that day on, Linda made it her job to watch Jake. Like, all the time. She turned into a spy, but not a cool one with sunglasses and a secret hideout. Nope, she was the annoying kind of spy, the kind who peeks out windows and tattles on people. Every single day, she found something to pick on Jake about. It was like a game to her, but Jake wasn't playing. Take the lawn, for example. One sunny afternoon, Jake was out mowing his grass. The mower went vroom vroom, and the air smelled like fresh cut green stuff. It was a normal day, and Jake was just doing normal stuff. But Linda? She popped up like a jack-in-the-box. She stood behind her curtains, those thin white ones that flutter in the breeze, and stared. Her eyes followed Jake back and forth, like she was counting every blade of grass he cut. Then, she ran outside with her clipboard again. "Your grass is too short," she shouted, waving her arms. "It's supposed to be 2 inches tall, not 1.5. She pulled out a tiny ruler, seriously, a ruler, and bent down to measure the grass. Jake stopped the mower and looked at her. "It's fine, ma'am," he said, still calm as a sleepy cat. But Linda scribbled on her clipboard anyway, muttering, "Ruining the neighborhood. Just ruining it." Another time, it was about his car. Jake drove a little blue pickup truck, nothing fancy. One evening, he parked it in front of his house after a long day. The street was quiet, and the sun was setting all orange and pretty. But guess who showed up? Linda, of course. She marched over with a tape measure, this time like the kind you use to measure a table or something. She stretched it out from the curb to Jake's truck tire. "Too close," she barked. "You're 3 inches from the curb. It's supposed to be 6 inches. She pointed at the truck like it was a monster. Jake leaned out his window and said, "It's parked fine, ma'am." Same calm voice, same little smile. Linda's face got red again, and she scribbled more notes. "You're ruining our neighborhood," she yelled, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Every day, it was something new. If Jake put his trash cans out, Linda said they were too early. If his dog, Max, a tiny little pup with floppy ears, barked once, Linda said it was too loud. Max barely made a peep, by the way. He was the kind of dog who'd rather nap than chase squirrels. But Linda didn't care. She'd stomp over, wave her rulebook, and shout, "This isn't allowed. You're breaking the rules." The neighbors started noticing. They'd peek out their doors or whisper over fences. "What's Linda so mad about now?" they'd say. "That new guy doesn't seem so bad." And he didn't. Jake was nice. He waved hello, he kept his yard clean, and he didn't cause trouble. But Linda? She acted like he was the worst person ever. She'd march around telling everyone, "He's no good. I'll prove it." Jake, though, didn't fight back. Not once. He'd just nod or shrug or say, "Okay, ma'am." It was weird how calm he stayed. Too calm, maybe. Like when your little brother spills juice on the floor and you don't yell because you've got a secret plan to get him back later. That kind of calm. And here's the kicker, Jake did have a secret. A big one. Linda had no clue, but every time she yelled at him, he was watching her right back. Not with a mean look, just with quiet eyes that saw everything. See, Linda thought she was the boss. She thought she could scare Jake into following her rules. She'd huff and puff and scribble her notes, thinking, I'll fix this guy. He'll learn. But Jake wasn't scared. Not even a little. He'd mow his lawn, park his truck, and lock his mailbox like nothing was wrong. And every time Linda got mad, he'd smile that tiny smile. It drove her nuts. One morning, things got even crazier. Jake was watering his flowers, pretty yellow ones, by his porch. The hose sprayed a gentle shhh sound, and the water sparkled in the sun. Linda saw him from her window and decided this was her chance. She grabbed her clipboard and ran over, her slippers flapping on the pavement. You're wasting water, she shouted. We only water on Tuesdays, and it's Wednesday. Jake turned off the hose and looked at her. It's just a little water, ma'am, he said. Linda's eyes got huge, like she'd caught him stealing candy. A little water, she screeched. This is serious. You're breaking the rules again. She wrote so fast her pen almost tore the paper. Jake didn't say anything. He just rolled up the hose and went inside. Linda stood there, huffing and puffing, thinking she'd won. She turned to the neighbors watching from their yards and said, See? I told you he's trouble. But the neighbors didn't look so sure. One lady, Mrs. Carter, whispered to her husband, He seems nice to me. Linda's the one yelling all the time. And she was right. Linda was loud. Linda was bossy. And Linda was starting to look silly. But she didn't stop. Oh no. The next day, Jake hung a wind chime on his porch. It was a little thing with bells that went ting-ting in the breeze. Pretty, right? Not to Linda. She heard it from her house and came running. Noise pollution, she yelled, pointing at the chime. Take it down right now. Jake peeked out his door and said, It's just a chime, ma'am. Linda crossed her arms and tapped her foot. It's against the rules, she snapped. Scribble, scribble, scribble went her pen. By now, the whole neighborhood knew Linda was after Jake. Kids on bikes would ride by and giggle. There goes Mailbox man, they'd say. Old Mr. Thompson, who lived next door, would shake his head and mutter, She's got too much time on her hands. Everyone saw it, everyone but Linda. She thought she was winning. She thought Jake was some rule-breaking troublemaker who'd give up and move away. But Jake wasn't going anywhere. He kept doing his thing. He'd wave at the kids, chat with Mr. Thompson, and lock his mailbox every night. And every time Linda came over to yell, he'd listen, nod, and stay cool as a cucumber. It was like he was waiting for something. Like he knew something big was coming, something Linda didn't see. And trust me, he did. Linda thought she was the smart one, the one in charge. She'd stomp around with her clipboard, barking orders, thinking she had Jake all figured out. But Jake? He was watching her every move. Every huff, every puff, every scribble. He didn't say much, but his eyes said plenty. They were sharp, quiet eyes that noticed things. Things like how Linda's trash cans were never quite right. Things like how she'd sneak around at night, peeking at people's houses. Things she didn't want anyone to know. The tension kept building, like a rubber band stretching tighter and tighter. Linda kept pushing. Jake kept waiting. The neighbors kept watching. And that little mailbox lock? It was just the start. Something big was brewing, something that would flip everything upside down. Linda thought she was the hunter, chasing down a troublemaker. But she didn't know she was the one being hunted. Not yet. So, what do you think was gonna happen next? Linda's yelling and Jake's quiet smile, something had to give, right? Stick around, because this story's about to get even juicier. Okay, let's keep this story rolling. Days turned into weeks, and things started heating up in the neighborhood. Linda, that bossy HOA lady with her clipboard, wasn't slowing down. Nope, she was getting braver, louder, and nosier every single day. She'd decided Jake, the new guy with the locked mailbox, was her big problem, and she wasn't going to let him off easy. Oh no, she was on a mission, and it was getting wild. Picture this, one sunny morning, Linda marched right up to Jake's front door. Knock knock knock. Her fist hit the wood so hard the birds in the trees flew away. Jake opened the door, rubbing sleepy eyes, still in his pajamas. Linda didn't care. She pointed at his trash cans by the curb and yelled, "Those cans are too visible. You can't leave them out where everyone can see them." Her voice was loud, like a teacher scolding a kid for running in the hall. Jake peeked outside. His trash cans were just sitting there, normal as can be. One was green for recycling, one was black for garbage. They weren't tipped over or messy or anything. But Linda acted like they were a giant pile of stinky junk ruining the whole street. Jake scratched his head and said, "They're fine, ma'am. I'll look into it." He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just nodded, calm as a turtle on a rock. Linda huffed, like a big gust of wind, and waved her HOA rule book in the air. That book was her favorite thing. It had all the neighborhood rules typed out in tiny letters. She held it up like it was a magic wand that could make Jake obey her. "It's in the rules," she barked. "Trash cans have to be hidden." Then she stomped off, her shoes smacking the ground. She thought Jake was scared of her. She thought he was weak, like a little mouse she could boss around. But she was so wrong. Then there was Jake's dog, Max. Max was the cutest little terrier you ever saw. He had floppy ears, a wagging tail, and a bark so tiny it sounded like a squeak. Yap yap. That's all he'd do, maybe once or twice when the mailman came by. But to Linda, that was too loud. Way too loud. One afternoon, Max was napping on Jake's porch, soaking up the sun. He let out one little yap when a squirrel ran by. Just one. Linda heard it from her house across the street. She bolted outside like someone had set off a fire alarm. "That dog is too loud," she shouted, running over with her rulebook flapping in her hand. She stood on Jake's lawn, pointing at Max like he was a roaring lion instead of a sleepy pup. "Dogs can't bark like that. It's against the rules." Jake stepped outside and scooped Max up in his arms. The little dog wagged his tail and licked Jake's chin. "He barely barks, ma'am," Jake said, still super calm. "I'll look into it." Linda's face got all scrunched up, like she'd bitten a sour lemon. She didn't like that answer. She wanted Jake to say sorry and promise Max would never bark again. But Jake didn't. He just stood there, petting Max, while Linda scribbled on her clipboard. "Too loud," she muttered. "Way too loud." Linda thought she had Jake figured out. She thought he was some quiet guy who'd give up and follow her rules if she kept yelling. Every time he said, "I'll look into it," she smirked, thinking, "I've got him now." But here's the secret she didn't know, Jake wasn't weak at all. He wasn't scared of her huffing and puffing. Nope. He was watching her right back. Every time she came over, every time she waved that rule book, Jake's brain was taking notes. Quiet little notes nobody could see. One day, things got even crazier. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and Jake was out by his mailbox. That locked mailbox Linda hated so much. He was just checking his letters, humming a little tune. The lock clicked open, he grabbed his mail, and it clicked shut again. Simple stuff. But guess who was watching? Linda. She'd been peeking from her window, her nose pressed against the glass like a kid staring at candy. Suddenly, she ran outside and crept closer. She tiptoed across the street, trying to be sneaky. Her slippers didn't make a sound as she got near Jake's mailbox. She bent down low, her eyes squinting, trying to peek inside that tiny slot. What was in there? Why did Jake lock it? She had to know. Her fingers even brushed the metal, like she might try to open it herself. Jake turned around just in time. "Hey, ma'am," he said, his voice nice and steady. "What are you doing?" Linda jumped up fast, her face turning pink. She wasn't sneaky enough, and now she was caught. "What's so important in there?" she snapped, crossing her arms. Her voice was sharp, like a teacher asking why you didn't do your homework. Jake shrugged. Just a little shrug, like it was no big deal. "Just mail," he said. "That's all." 2 words. But here's the cool part, his eyes twinkled. Like stars blinking in the night sky. Like he was hiding something super juicy, Something Linda couldn't guess. It wasn't just mail, not boring old letters and bills. Nope, it was something bigger. Something secret. But he didn't tell her that. He just smiled that tiny smile and walked back to his house. Linda stood there, staring at the mailbox. She didn't see the twinkle in Jake's eyes. She didn't catch the hint. She was too busy thinking up her next plan. He's hiding something, she muttered to herself. I'll find out what it is. She scribbled on her clipboard big, messy scribbles this time and marched home. She thought she was so smart. She thought she'd catch Jake doing something bad and prove he didn't belong in her perfect neighborhood. But here's the thing, every step Linda took, every time she yelled or snooped, she was digging herself into trouble. A big, deep hole she didn't even see. Jake wasn't just sitting there letting her boss him around. Oh no. He was watching. He was waiting. He was collecting little clues, like puzzle pieces, in his head. And Linda? She had no idea she was the one in danger, not Jake. The days kept going, and Linda kept pushing. One evening, Jake was raking leaves in his yard. The leaves were all orange and crunchy, and he was making neat little piles. Scritch scratch went the rake. It was a peaceful sound, like music for a fall day. But Linda didn't think so. She popped out of her house like a jack in the box, her clipboard ready. Those piles are too big, she yelled, pointing at the leaves. They're an eyesore. You're breaking the rules again. Jake leaned on his rake and looked at her. They're just leaves, ma'am, he said. I'll look into it. Linda's face got redder than the leaves on the ground. She waved her rulebook and shouted, "This is serious. You can't do this." Then she wrote more notes, her pen scratching like an angry cat. The neighbors started peeking out their windows. Old Mr. Thompson, who lived next door, shook his head. "She's at it again," he mumbled. Mrs. Carter, down the street, whispered to her kids, "Poor Jake. Linda won't leave him alone." Everyone saw it. Linda was picking on Jake for tiny things: trash cans, a quiet dog, a locked mailbox, some leaves. But Jake? He stayed cool. Too cool, maybe. Another time, Jake hung a bird feeder in his tree. It was a little wooden house with seeds for the birds. Tweet tweet. The sparrows loved it, fluttering around and pecking at the food. It was cute. But Linda? She hated it. She stormed over the next morning, her slippers flapping. "That feeder's too high," she barked. "It's against the rules." Jake looked up at the tree and said, "It's fine, ma'am. I'll look into it." Linda scribbled and stomped off, muttering about messy birds. Every day, it was something new. If Jake watered his grass, Linda said it was the wrong day. If he put up a porch light, Linda said it was too bright. She'd knock on his door, wave her rulebook, and yell. And every time, Jake would nod, say, "I'll look into it," and watch her leave. Linda thought she was winning. She thought Jake was some pushover she could scare away. But Jake wasn't scared. Not even a little. He'd rake his leaves, feed his birds, and lock his mailbox like nothing was wrong. And every time Linda came over, his eyes would twinkle just a bit. That twinkle meant something. It meant he wasn't just taking her yelling. He was figuring her out. He was seeing things, little things she didn't want anyone to notice. Like what? Well, Jake started noticing how Linda's own yard wasn't so perfect. Her trash cans. Sometimes they stayed out too long. Her flowers. They were messy, with weeds popping up. And at night, when she thought nobody was looking, Linda would sneak around, peeking at other people's houses. Jake saw it all. He didn't say anything, but he saw. Linda kept digging her hole deeper. She kept snooping, kept yelling, kept writing her notes. She thought she was the boss, the queen of the street. But Jake? He was the one with the real power. He was quiet, but he was smart. And every time Linda got bolder, he got closer to something big. Something that would surprise her and everyone else. The tension was growing, like a balloon getting bigger and bigger. Linda thought she was in charge, chasing Jake down with her rules. But Jake was waiting. Watching. Ready. And that mailbox? That little lock Linda hated so much. It was the key to everything. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out. All right, Here we go. This is the big moment, the day everything flipped upside down. It was a regular afternoon in the neighborhood. The sun was shining, kids were riding bikes, and the air smelled like fresh grass. Jake was out by his mailbox again, that little locked mailbox Linda couldn't stand. He was just standing there, turning the key, checking his letters like he always did. Click click went the lock. No big deal, right? Wrong. Not to Linda. Linda was watching from her window, like she did every day. Her nose was practically squished against the glass, her eyes glued to Jake. She saw him open that mailbox, and something inside her snapped. She'd had enough. Weeks of yelling, weeks of snooping, weeks of scribbling on her clipboard, it all boiled up like a pot of water bubbling over. She threw open her front door and screamed, "That's it?" Her voice was so loud it echoed down the street, scaring a cat up a tree. She stormed across the road, her slippers flapping like crazy. Her face was redder than a fire truck and her hands were shaking. She yanked her phone out of her pocket and waved it in the air like a flag. "I'm calling 911, she shouted, pointing at Jake. "You're hiding something illegal in there." "I know it." Her finger jabbed toward the mailbox like it was a monster she had to slay. Jake didn't move. Not an inch. He didn't jump or yell or even look scared. Nope. He just leaned against his porch railing, cool as a cucumber. His arms were crossed, and he watched her with that little smile he always had. Linda didn't notice how calm he was. She was too busy yelling. She punched the numbers into her phone, 9-1-1, and held it to her ear, glaring at Jake the whole time. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice picked up. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher said. Linda didn't waste a second. She started ranting, her words tumbling out like marbles spilling from a jar. "There's a suspicious man here," she shouted. "He's got a locked mailbox, and he's hiding something bad. Send the cops now. Right now." She was so loud the neighbors peeked out their doors, wondering what was going on. Jake still didn't budge. He stood there, leaning on the porch, watching her like she was putting on a funny show. The dispatcher said something like, "Okay, ma'am, we'll send someone," and Linda hung up. She crossed her arms and smirked at Jake. That smirk was big and smug, like she'd just won a prize at the fair. "You're done now," she said, nodding her head. "The police are coming, and they'll find out what you're up to." Linda thought she'd finally beaten him. She thought the cops would roll up, open that mailbox, and drag Jake away. She stood there, tapping her foot, waiting for her big win. The neighbors watched, too. Old Mr. Thompson leaned on his cane by his fence. Mrs. Carter stood on her porch with her kids. Everyone was curious. What was going to happen? Was Linda right about Jake? Then it got wild, really wild. Sirens started wailing in the distance. Woo woo woo. That sound you hear when police cars are speeding closer. It was loud and getting louder fast. Way faster than you'd expect. Linda's smirk grew even bigger. She rubbed her hands together, thinking, "Here they come. I've got him now." The sound bounced off the houses, and soon, everyone could see the flashing lights, red and blue, spinning like tops. 2 police cars zoomed down the street and screeched to a stop right in front of Jake's house. Tires squealed, and dust flew up from the road. The doors popped open, and 4 officers jumped out. They had shiny badges, dark uniforms, and serious faces. Linda bounced on her toes, so excited she could hardly stand still. "See," she said to Jake, pointing at the cars. "I told you. You're in trouble now. But here's where it gets crazy, super crazy." The cops didn't even look at Jake. Not one glance. They didn't walk toward his mailbox or his porch. Nope. They turned the other way and marched straight across the street right to Linda's house. Their boots thumped on the pavement, loud and steady. Linda's smirk froze. Her eyes got wide, like 2 big saucers. "Huh," she mumbled, blinking fast. One of the officers, a tall guy with a deep voice, stopped in front of Linda's door. He looked at her and said, "Linda Grayson." His tone was sharp, like a teacher calling your name when you're in trouble. Linda's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. She just nodded, all confused. The officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, shiny, silver ones that clicked when he moved them. "You're coming with us," he said. Linda's jaw dropped. Like, all the way to the ground dropped. "What's this about?" she sputtered, her voice wobbly now. She wasn't yelling anymore. She wasn't smirking. She looked like a kid who'd dropped her ice cream in the dirt. The other officers started walking into her house, carrying little bags and notebooks. What was going on? The neighbors gasped. Mr. Thompson's cane almost fell over. Mrs. Carter's kids whispered, "Whoa." And then bam, the big reveal hit. Jake stepped off his porch, nice and slow, and walked over. He didn't say much at first, just watched as the cops surrounded Linda. Then he spoke, super calm like always. "Told you it was just mail, ma'am," he said. But that twinkle in his eyes? It was brighter than ever. Linda stared at him, her brain spinning like a top. What did he mean? Here's the truth, the huge, amazing truth: Jake wasn't just some regular guy. Nope. He was an undercover cop. That's right, a secret police officer who pretends to be normal so he can catch bad guys. He'd been sent to this neighborhood for a special job. And guess who he was investigating? Linda. Sweet, rule-loving, clipboard-waving Linda. She thought she was the boss, but Jake had been watching her the whole time. That locked mailbox she hated so much. It wasn't just for letters and bills. Oh no. It was a hiding spot for evidence, stuff Jake had been collecting to prove Linda was breaking the law. Inside that little metal box were photos, notes, and even recordings. Secret stuff he'd gathered over weeks. Pictures of Linda sneaking around at night. Notes about her yelling at neighbors for no reason. Recordings of her voice, caught on a tiny microphone, talking about sneaky things she didn't want anyone to know. What kind of sneaky things? Well, Linda wasn't as perfect as she acted. She'd been stealing packages from people's porches, boxes with toys, clothes, all sorts of goodies. She'd grab them when no one was looking and hide them in her garage. She'd also been bothering neighbors, making up fake rules just to boss them around. And the worst part? She was faking HOA fines, telling people they owed money for silly stuff like ugly flowers or loud birds. Then she'd keep the cash for herself instead of giving it to the neighborhood group. Jake knew all of this. Every time Linda came over to yell about his trash cans or his dog, he was watching her. Every time she snooped by his mailbox, he added more to his evidence pile. He stayed quiet, stayed calm, and let her dig her own hole. And now? The cops were here not for Jake, but for her. Her own 911 call had made it so easy. She'd practically invited them right to her doorstep. Linda's face went white, like she'd seen a ghost. "This is a mistake," she yelled, flapping her arms. "I didn't do anything." But the officers didn't listen. They clicked the handcuffs on her wrist, snap snap, and started walking her to the police car. She twisted and turned, trying to wiggle free, but they held on tight. "You've got the wrong person," she shouted. "It's him. Check his mailbox." One of the cops, a lady with short hair, turned to Jake. "Show us," she said. Jake nodded and walked over to his mailbox. He turned the key, click, and opened it up. Inside was a little black box. He pulled it out and handed it to the cop. She opened it, and there it was, a stack of papers, a tiny camera, and a recorder. Proof. Real proof of everything Linda had done. The lady cop flipped through the papers and nodded. "Good work," she said to Jake. Linda's eyes got so big they almost popped out. "What?" she screeched. "He's with you." The tall officer grinned. "Yep. Officer Miller's been on this case for weeks. Thanks for the call, though it sped things up." Linda's legs wobbled. She looked at Jake, then at the cops, then back at Jake. Her brain couldn't keep up. The neighbors were whispering like crazy now. "He's a cop," Mr. Thompson said, scratching his head. "No way." Mrs. Carter's kids cheered, "Cool." Everyone was shocked, everyone but Jake. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, like it was no big deal. The cops started pulling stuff out of Linda's house, boxes she'd stolen, stacks of fake fine letters, even a bag of cash she'd hidden under her couch. It was all there, out in the open for the whole street to see. Linda's perfect little world was falling apart, and she couldn't stop it. Her 911 call, the one she thought would get Jake in trouble, had backfired big time. She'd called the cops on herself without even knowing it. Jake watched as they put Linda in the police car. She was still yelling, "This isn't fair. I'm the victim. But the door slammed shut, and the sirens started up again. Woo woo woo. The cars pulled away, lights flashing, taking Linda off to face the music. The street went quiet, and Jake turned back to his house. He didn't cheer or laugh or anything. He just walked inside, like it was another normal day. But it wasn't normal. Not anymore. The big day had come, and the big secret was out. Linda thought she was the hunter, chasing Jake down with her rules and her phone. But Jake? He was the real hunter all along. That mailbox lock she hated? It was the key to her downfall. And now, everyone knew the truth. Alright, here we are, the part where everything gets wrapped up. The big day had just exploded with that wild reveal, and now it was time for things to settle down. Linda, the bossy HOA lady, was in deep trouble. Picture this: the police cars were parked right in front of her house, their red and blue lights flashing like a big show. The tall officer with the deep voice held Linda's arms while he clicked those shiny silver handcuffs on her wrist. Snap snap. Her hands were stuck together now, and she couldn't wiggle free no matter how hard she tried. Linda's face wasn't red anymore. Nope, it was pale like the color of a ghost or a piece of paper that's been left in the sun too long. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth kept opening and closing like a fish out of water. The cops started talking to her, reading her rights. That's something they say to people when they get arrested, like, you don't have to talk, and you can get a lawyer. It's super serious stuff. The tall officer's voice was loud and clear. Linda Grayson, you're under arrest for stealing and lying and breaking the law. Linda didn't like that one bit. This is a mistake, she yelled, her voice all squeaky now. She twisted her body, trying to pull away from the cops, but they held on tight. I didn't do anything wrong, she shouted. You've got the wrong person. Her slippers slid on the ground as she stomped her feet, but the officers didn't let go. They'd heard her yelling before, and they weren't buying it this time. The neighbors were watching everything. They peeked out their windows, hiding behind curtains, or stood on their porches with big, curious eyes. Old Mr. Thompson, the guy with the cane, leaned against his fence. His mouth was open a little, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mrs. Carter, down the street, held her kids' hands while they stared. Is that Linda? One of the kids whispered. Yep, Mrs. Carter said, nodding slow. Everyone knew Linda was in big trouble now, and they knew she couldn't talk her way out of it. Then Jake stepped forward. He'd been so quiet during all the yelling and sirens, just standing by his porch with his arms crossed. Now he walked closer, his sneakers quiet on the grass. He looked at Linda, his face calm as ever like a still pond with no ripples. You should have left the mailbox alone, Linda, he said. His voice wasn't loud or mean. It was soft, steady, like he was just telling her the weather. But those words hit Linda hard. Her eyes got even wider, and she stopped wiggling for a second. What? She mumbled, staring at him. Jake didn't say more. He didn't need to. The cops were already busy proving everything. The lady officer with the short hair walked out of Linda's house, her arms full. She carried a big stack of mail, letters and packages that didn't belong to Linda. Stuff she'd taken from other people's porches. The neighbors gasped when they saw it. That's my box. Mrs. Carter yelled, pointing at a package with bright red tape. It went missing last week. The tall officer nodded and kept pulling more stuff from Linda's garage. It was like a treasure hunt, but not the fun kind. He found more stolen mail envelopes with names that weren't Linda's, little boxes with toys and books inside. There were even some bigger packages, like the kind you get when you order something special online. Linda had hidden them all in her garage, behind old paint cans and a rusty bike. She thought nobody would ever find them. But Jake did. And now the cops did, too. That's proof, the lady officer said, holding up the stack. Proof she can't deny. Linda's face crumpled, like a piece of paper you scrunch into a ball. No, 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 she shouted, shaking her head fast. That's not mine. Someone planted it there. But nobody believed her. The neighbors saw the names on the packages, names like Thompson and Carter and Lee, and they knew the truth. Linda had been sneaking around, taking their stuff, pretending she was perfect while she broke the law. The cops didn't stop there. They found more in her house. Under her couch, they pulled out a bag of cash, crumpled dollar bills and coins she'd collected from fake HOA fines. She'd been telling people they owed money for silly things, like too many flowers or wrong color curtains. Then she'd keep the cash instead of giving it to the neighborhood group. It was sneaky and wrong, and now it was all out in the open. The tall officer held up the bag and shook it. Jingle jingle went the coins. "This yours, too?" he asked Linda. Linda's voice got small. I I don't know how that got there," she mumbled. But her lie was falling apart. The neighbors whispered to each other. "She fined me $20 for my dog's leash," Mr. Thompson said, his voice grumpy. "And my flowers weren't even ugly," Mrs. Carter added. Everyone was mad now. They'd trusted Linda to run the HOA, but she'd been tricking them the whole time. The lady officer walked over to the police car with the stolen mail. She opened the trunk pop and started piling it inside. The tall officer grabbed Linda's arm again. "Time to go," he said. Linda's clipboard was still in her hand, that thing she always carried to write her rules. But now it slipped out and fell to the ground with a loud clatter. It bounced once, twice, then lay there in the dirt, all alone. Linda stared at it, her eyes watery, but the cops didn't wait. They pulled her toward the car. "No!" Linda yelled one last time. "This isn't fair. I'm the good one here." She dragged her feet, kicking up little clouds of dust, but the officers were strong. They opened the car door creak and guided her inside. Linda flopped onto the seat, her slippers dangling off her toes. The door slammed shut bang and that was it. She was locked in, her face pressed against the window, looking out at the street she used to boss around. The police cars started their engines. Vroom vroom. The sirens flicked on again, woo woo woo, and the lights flashed red and blue. The neighbors watched as the cars rolled away, slow at first, then faster. Linda's pale face disappeared behind the tinted glass, and soon the sirens faded into the distance. She was gone, off to face the consequences of all her sneaky tricks. The street got quiet, like it was taking a big breath after a crazy storm. Jake didn't cheer or clap or anything. He didn't even smile big. He just turned around and walked back to his house. His little dog, Max, was waiting on the porch, wagging his tiny tail. "Yap yap." Max barked, happy to see him. Jake bent down and scratched Max's ears. "Good boy," he said, soft and quiet. Then he went inside, carrying a box he'd been unpacking before all the chaos started. To Jake, it was like nothing huge had happened. He was just doing his job, unpacking his stuff and keeping the neighborhood safe. But to everyone else, it was a big deal. A huge deal. The neighborhood started buzzing with whispers as soon as the police cars were out of sight. People stepped out of their houses, blinking in the sunlight, talking all at once. "Did you see that?" Mr. Thompson said to Mrs. Carter. "Jake's a cop?" "A real cop." Mrs. Carter nodded, her kids jumping around her. "He tricked Linda," one kid shouted. "She's gone now." The guy they'd ignored, the quiet new guy with the locked mailbox, was the hero all along. Nobody had paid much attention to Jake before. He'd been the one mowing his lawn, walking his dog, waving hello while Linda yelled at him. They'd thought he was just some regular person, maybe even a little weird with that mailbox lock. But now, they saw him different. He wasn't just Jake. He was Officer Jake, the undercover cop who'd saved them from Linda's sneaky ways. People started acting nicer to him right away. The next morning, Mrs. Carter walked over with a plate of cookies, chocolate chip ones, still warm from the oven. She knocked on Jake's door, tap tap, and smiled when he opened it. "These are for you," she said, holding out the plate. "Thanks for what you did." Jake took the cookies and nodded. "Thanks, ma'am," he said, that same calm voice he always used. Mrs. Carter smiled bigger. "Call me Sue," she said, then walked back home. Mr. Thompson was next. He hobbled over with his cane later that day, carrying a little bag of apples from his tree. "Good job, son," he said, handing them to Jake. "Didn't know you were a hero." Jake scratched his head, a tiny bit shy. "Just doing my job, sir," he said. Mr. Thompson chuckled. "Well, you're welcome here anytime." Then he waved and shuffled back to his porch. Even the kids got in on it. The ones who rode bikes up and down the street started calling him Mailbox Man like it was a superhero name. "Hey, Mailbox Man," they'd yell, pedaling by his house. "You're cool." Jake would wave from his yard, a little smile on his face. He didn't mind the nickname. It was better than Troublemaker, which is what Linda used to call him. The neighborhood felt different now. Lighter, happier, like a big weight had lifted off everyone's shoulders. Linda had been the bossy cloud hanging over them, always yelling about rules and fines. But with her gone, people could breathe again. They could mow their lawns how they wanted, park their cars without a ruler, even put locks on their mailboxes if they felt like it. Nobody was scared of getting in trouble for silly things anymore. And the HOA? Oh, that changed, too. A few days after Linda got hauled off, the neighbors had a meeting. They gathered in Mrs. Carter's backyard, sitting on folding chairs with lemonade and snacks. "We need a new leader," Mr. Thompson said, tapping his cane on the ground. "Someone who's not like Linda." Everyone nodded. They didn't want another dictator waving a rulebook and stealing their stuff. Mrs. Carter raised her hand. "I'll do it," she said. "But I promise no fake fines, no yelling. Just keeping things nice." The neighbors clapped. "Sounds good," someone shouted. They voted right there, raising their hands one by one. Mrs. Carter Sue won easy. She smiled and said, "Let's make this a happy place again." And they did. The HOA stopped being a scary thing and turned into a friendly group that helped out instead of bossing around. Jake didn't go to the meeting. He stayed home, unpacking more boxes and playing with Max in the yard. He didn't need to be there, he'd already done his part. But the neighbors talked about him anyway. "That Jake's a good guy," Mr. Thompson said, sipping his lemonade. "Quiet, but smart." Sue nodded. "He saved us from Linda. We owe him." Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood kept changing for the better. People waved hello to Jake every morning. Kids drew pictures of Mailbox Man with crayons and taped them to his fence. Someone even left a little note on his porch that said, "Thanks for being awesome," in big, wobbly letters. Jake didn't say much about it, he wasn't the type to brag, but you could tell he liked it. His little smile got a tiny bit bigger every time someone stopped by. Linda's house stayed empty. The cops had taken all her stolen stuff back to the right owners, and her garage door hung open, showing the rusty bike and old paint cans she'd left behind. Nobody knew what would happen to it, maybe someone new would move in someday. But for now, it was just a quiet reminder of the lady who thought she ruled the street and lost everything. Jake kept living his life, simple and calm. He'd mow his lawn, walk Max, and lock his mailbox every night. The lock didn't seem so weird anymore, it was just Jake being Jake. And the neighbors? They didn't mind one bit. They'd learned their lesson, don't judge someone before you know them. The guy they'd ignored turned out to be the one who fixed everything. Justice was served big time. Linda got caught, her sneaky tricks got stopped, and the neighborhood got free. She'd tried to make Jake look bad, but she'd only made herself look worse. The cops took her away, the evidence proved her wrong, and the people she'd bossed around got their peace back. It was fair, it was right, and it felt good, like the happy ending in a storybook. The street stayed quiet after that, but it was a good kind of quiet. Birds chirped, kids laughed, and neighbors chatted over fences. Jake's little house fit right in, like it had always been there. And every time he walked outside, someone would wave or smile or say, "Hey, Jake." He'd wave back, Max trotting by his side, and keep on with his day. The hero didn't need a cape, just a mailbox lock and a sharp pair of eyes. Okay, friends, we've made it to the end of this crazy story. The police cars are gone, Linda's in big trouble, and Jake's back to his quiet life with his little dog, Max. The neighborhood's all peaceful now, with kids riding bikes and neighbors waving hello. But before we say goodbye, let's sit down for a minute like we're on a big porch swing together and talk about what happened. There's something really cool to think about here, something that might make you look at people a little different from now on. So, here's the thing, sometimes the person you think is weak or small or not important is actually the one with all the power. It's like in a card game, maybe you've played one with your friends, like Go Fish or Uno. You look at someone's pile of cards, and you think, oh, they don't have much. I'll win easy. But then surprise, they've got the best cards hidden away, and they beat you when you least expect it. That's what happened with Jake and Linda. Linda thought she had everything figured out. She saw Jake, this quiet guy who just moved in, and she judged him fast. She didn't like his locked mailbox, his trash cans, his tiny dog Max nothing. She thought he was just some regular person she could boss around with her clipboard and her rules. That locked mailbox drove her nuts. She thought it made him sneaky or bad. And Jake's quiet smile. She thought it meant he was scared of her, like a little mouse hiding from a big cat. She was so sure she was the strong one, the one in charge, the one who'd win every time. But oh boy, was she wrong. Linda didn't see the storm coming. You know how storms sneak up sometimes. The sky's all sunny, birds are chirping, and then bam, dark clouds roll in, and thunder shakes the windows. That's what Jake was like. He stayed quiet, he stayed calm, but he was a storm waiting to happen. He wasn't just some guy with a mailbox, he was an undercover cop, watching her every move. All that time she was yelling and snooping, he was holding all the cards. He had the proof, the smarts, and the plan to flip everything upside down. Linda judged him by what she saw on the outside, his quiet ways, his simple house, that little lock. She didn't stop to think there might be more to him. She didn't give him a chance to show who he really was. And that was her big mistake. She thought she was the hunter, chasing Jake down with her rules and her phone call to 911. But Jake? He was the real hunter all along, waiting for the perfect moment to catch her. And when that moment came, wow, it was like a lightning bolt hitting her right in the middle of her perfect little world. So, here's something to chew on. Maybe next time you meet someone new, give them a chance. You know how it feels when you walk into a new class or a new place, and people look at you funny? Maybe they think you're shy or weird because you don't talk much at first. Or maybe they don't like your backpack or your sneakers, and they decide you're not cool. It stinks, right? Well, that's what Linda did to Jake. She looked at him, made up her mind, and never bothered to see the real him. What if she'd been nice instead? What if she'd knocked on his door with a plate of cookies and said, "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood," instead of yelling about his mailbox? Things might have gone different. She might have found out Jake was a good guy, a hero, even, and they could have been friends. But nope. She judged him quick, and it cost her everything. Her sneaky tricks got caught, the cops took her away, and now she's sitting somewhere wishing she'd done things another way. You never know who's about to flip the script. That's a fun way to say change everything, like when a movie twists at the end, and you go, whoa, I didn't see that coming. Maybe the quiet kid in your class is super smart and wins a big award someday. Maybe the person who seems boring is secretly awesome at drawing or singing or something cool. Or maybe, just maybe, the new neighbor with a funny hat or a loud laugh turns out to be the best friend you ever make. You don't know until you give him a chance. Think about Jake for a second. He didn't look like a hero at first. He didn't wear a cape or drive a fancy car or shout about how great he was. He was just a guy with a mailbox lock and a tiny dog. But inside, he was strong. He was brave. He was patient. He watched Linda, collected his proof, and waited for the right time to show everyone the truth. He didn't need to yell or fight, he just did what was right, and that made him the winner. And Linda? She thought she was big and tough, but she was wrong about everything. She judged Jake by his outside, not his inside. She thought power came from being loud and bossy, but real power? It's quieter than that. It's in the way you treat people, the way you listen, the way you wait for the truth to come out. Linda didn't get that, and it's why she lost. She's probably sitting in a jail cell right now, thinking about that clipboard she dropped and wishing she'd been kinder. So, what can we take from this? Maybe it's this: don't be like Linda. Don't look at someone and decide they're not worth your time. Give people a shot, say hi, smile, ask them how their day's going. You might be surprised. The person you think is small might turn out to be huge. The one you ignore might end up saving the day. Life's full of twists, and you don't want to miss the good ones because you're too busy judging. Let's flip it around, too. What if you're the one holding the cards? Maybe you feel quiet or shy sometimes, like nobody sees how awesome you are. That's okay. Jake was quiet, too, and look what he did. You don't have to be loud or show off to be strong. You can be yourself, your real, true self, and still make a difference. Maybe you're good at something nobody knows about yet, like drawing or helping friends or figuring stuff out. Keep being you, and one day, people might see the storm you've got inside, the good kind of storm that changes things for the better. This story's got me thinking about my own neighborhood. I bet you're thinking about yours, 2. Who's the Linda in your life? Who's the Jake? Maybe there's someone you've judged without meaning to, someone you could be nicer to next time you see them. Or maybe you're the Jake, waiting for your moment to shine. Either way, it's pretty cool to imagine, right? People are like books, you can't tell what's inside just by looking at the cover. What do you think? Did Linda get what she deserved? I mean, she stole stuff, lied, and bossed everyone around. Then she got caught, and the cops took her away. Was that fair? Or do you feel a little sorry for her? Maybe she didn't start out mean, maybe she just got lost along the way. Drop your ideas below, I'd love to hear what you think. No right or wrong answers, just your thoughts. And hey, if you like this twisty tale, share it with a friend. Tell them about Jake and his mailbox, Linda and her clipboard, and that wild day the police cars showed up. It's a story about surprises, about giving people a chance, about how the quiet ones can be the strongest. Maybe your friends got a story like this, too, something crazy that happened where they live. You could swap tales and laugh about it together. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. It's been a fun ride, sirens, secrets, and all. I'll see you in the next story, okay? Keep your eyes open out there, you never know who's holding the cards. Bye for now, and take care.